The dogs of war are upon us once again, gentlemen. It's time to talk about the conflict in Syria and some recent happenings. And once I get through with that, let's talk about Middle Eastern geopolitics as a whole in case you haven't been following along. We've recently just had another chemical weapon attack in the city of Douma in Syria, and that has been disputed by various Western and Eastern nations. Russia has said that this chemical attack was not committed by the Assad regime. The United States has said it otherwise, with Trump personally tweeting out that Putin has backed barbarism and that he has a price to pay. This should alarm anyone who's been paying attention to this conflict. And of course, these chemical weapons attacks have no strategic value. Assad has proven himself to be at least a semi-competent military commander, along with the rest of his armed forces. Their victory is almost assured against the rebellion. Trump previously stated that he was going to pull troops and money and weapons out of the region, and it seems highly unlikely that Syria would commit such an act of terror on their own people with all of these recent developments. But again, if we look historically, none of the gas attacks that have happened in Syria have had any legitimacy at all. Two of them come to mind. I don't know if there's been any more than three that have really picked up any media coverage, but the very first one, and I remember this many, many years ago, it was either 2011, 2012, sometime shortly after the Arab Spring, and there was video evidence of Turkish trucks bringing in chemical weapons and hand-delivering it to a group of Islamic rebels in the northern part of Syria. This was caught on video. And even back then, there was no strategic value to gassing civilians, so again, it makes no sense. There's zero motivation for these attacks to be led by Assad. Now, what has happened is that these chemical weapons attacks only strengthens the West's resolve in getting involved in this conflict, and it seems just so happens that something like this would happen when all of a sudden the tides have finally shifted in Assad's favor. Of course, he's been winning for quite a few months now, perhaps even years, depending on how you look at things, but every time that the West does not want to further their involvement in Syria, there's another over-emotional gas attack that has no legitimacy at all, that's performed and then paraded around in the media for weeks on end, and the president is expected to respond. Now, the first gas attack under Trump's presidency, he responded with an airstrike on an airfield. However, I believe this was all a show, because the airfield in question, while he destroyed some older military equipment, the airfield really has no strategic value, and yet the armaments and the amount that was destroyed was very limited. If there was going to be a serious strike on Syria, it would not have been so milquetoast, let us say. But the happening alarms have been ringing in the past 12 to 16 hours as an airstrike has occurred in Syria, and questions as to who performed this airstrike have been going around the world. And again, Russia has come out to defend Assad against these unlawful strikes, but interestingly enough, the United States Department of Defense has denied any involvement in this military attack on another Syrian airfield. However, 2 p.m. Beirut time, Lebanon. The Lebanese military has released an official statement confirming that Israeli warplanes were behind the missile attack on Syria's T4 military airbase on very early Monday morning. These would be, I believe, F-14s. According to the Lebanon's Army Command Orientation Directorate, 4 Israeli warplanes violated Lebanese airspace between 3:25 a.m. to 3:35 a.m. on Monday, firing missiles whilst over the sea to the west of Junea. The initial point of infiltration that marked the 10-minute combat run was over the city of Baalbek, Baalbek. Given that Russian military authorities claim that 2 warplanes conducted the T4 airbase attack, it is possible that the additional 2 aircraft mentioned by Lebanon were only a part of the mission to provide electronic countermeasure support, a standard practice. They would be carrying some kind of jammer that would make it harder to lock onto the aircraft by SAMs or something of the like. They may also carry some sort of extra radio equipment if necessary, depending on the type of missiles that were used. I'm not exactly sure, probably some type of simple or relatively simple radar-guided air-to-surface missile. Now, what's interesting, if you look at the pictures, and I'll put them on screen now, the airfield is rather shoddy. It's not really an airfield. It looks more like a cemetery. And the accuracy of the strikes and the ordnance used looks to be pretty minor. This picture here, it seems to be some type of Sukhoi or MiG. I can't really tell, the bushes in the way, but some type of typical Eastern aircraft, some Russian design. But it seems to be a ghost town. It's almost like a scene from a Western film. Very minimal. It doesn't seem like T4 would be a very strategic thing to strike. Again, the same as the airfield that Trump directed to be struck earlier. But what is interesting about this is that Israel is behind it. And this should come as no surprise to anyone who is in the know about Israel's relationship with Syria and its ongoing conflict with Assad. And if I remember correctly, some of the missiles that were fired were intercepted. Now, on top of all of these happenings, it's also been reported that the Russian military is at a heightened alert, and that there have been some aircraft deployed from the Tartus fleet, and that the United States is currently mobilizing some of its Mediterranean and Middle Eastern forces as well. And we can only pray that there is no conflict between these groups. If Trump wants to get elected again in 2020, he's going to step down and call this shit show off before World War III kicks off over some pointless sand dune somewhere 10,000 miles away from us. But, what can you expect from someone who has such close friendly ties to Zionists like Netanyahu? But that being said, let me take some time to fully flush out what I think about the whole war in the Middle East and North Africa, because I've only briefly talked about it in a couple of videos, one in particular about Zionism a couple of months ago. If you know absolutely nothing about the wars in North Africa and the Middle East, let me show you one particular pattern that should be enough to tell you that something is going on there that you have not been told about. Now, the State of Israel has a vested interest in destroying various governments in the region, and I'll explain why. But it seems that any semi-secular or secular fascist or dictatorial regime must be destroyed and brought down in the name of freedom, democracy, whatever. They'll falsify whatever needs be falsified in order to garner the emotional support of the Shabbos Goy across the Western world. And when these semi-secular or secular fascist regimes get taken down, they get replaced by religious extremists, for lack of a better term. But you might be wondering, well, these religious extremists hate Jews more than the secular regimes. Why would Israel want these people in power? Well, here's the brilliance of their strategy. See, they understand that these religious extremist movements have a few vital flaws. Number one, they're not led by experienced leaders, they're led by religious leaders, which means they're not very intelligent and they have no idea what warfare or the management of a state ought to be like. Secondly, religious extremists fall, like many other political and religious movements, to the failures of purity spiraling, which means you will have splinter groups and endless little tiny states within these extremist groups that are constantly killing each other, vying for power. Because you see, the semi-secular or secular fascist regimes are united under a single leader. They're extremely powerful. This is what played out during the various wars at the start of Israel's life in the 40s and 50s. They were a great threat to Israel's sovereignty. But when you replace them with these endlessly purity spiraling, incoherent religious extremist groups, they're not a threat. They may commit acts of terror, sure, but they're not marching 1,000 T-55s to your border and coordinating an attack against you. The greatest threat that Israel has had from a religious extremist group has been ISIL, but we see as soon as the money stops flowing and the arms stop being airdropped into the country, they dry up and lose all their territory and no longer become a threat. This is the definition of controlled opposition. They can control what this religious extremist group is capable of doing at any given time, and they'll use them to play off against these other secular regimes through their purity spiraling. ISIS says that these other Islamic groups, including Saudi Arabia, are great threats to Islam, and they will wage a war against all of them. So you have a group that essentially wants to form a new caliphate, or I guess literally wants to. So they'll attack everybody at once. They'll make enemies of everyone around them. This makes them very vulnerable because they're not focused on a target, a singular target, which would be normally Israel underneath these fascist regimes. And when or if these religious extremist groups gain too much power, as I said, they'll stop the funding, they'll cut them off, they'll actually strike them militarily in an effective manner. See, what Obama and Bush have been doing, or did do, for the past 20 some odd years, is they very negligibly went after these extremist groups. You know, a tomahawk here, a JDAM here, a couple of precise strikes in some particular areas, lots of flashy photos and lots of nice YouTube videos of FLIR cams. Just bread and circus for the dumb Shabos Goy population to see. We're winning the war on terrorism. But you see, as soon as someone like Trump gets into office, the money stops, the arms stop, the precision airstrikes don't stop, they ramp up. An actual military intervention is started. Now, I've questioned Trump's motives for a long time, but you see what he was capable of doing is completely annihilating ISIS within just a few months. If that isn't proof that the previous administrations were just fucking around for the sake of it, bread and circus, for example, then I don't know what will convince you. Now, another interesting thing about these wars in North Africa and the Middle East, and one of the reasons why I include North Africa, is because these secular fascist regimes also are a threat to U.S.-Israeli global hegemony, and in particular the petrodollar. What these countries do, if you noticed, all of these Middle Eastern countries have tried to free themselves and their people of debt-backed fiat currency or endless empty money. They've always tried to return to some type of standard or put the control of the money back into the state's hands. And we see what happens with that when Gaddafi tried to create this trans-African gold-backed currency. That it would have been a great threat to the IMF and the established financial order. And so what did they do? They sent in the French jets to bomb the living hell out of him. And then they funded these religious extremist groups to go in there and drag him from his house kicking and screaming, or they violated his body and threw his corpse in a hole. And that's what happens when you threaten the international money supply, or you threaten the sovereignty of Israel. You get a bullet in the back of your head, no questions asked, and to the cheers of the world all the way around. But just as importantly, we have to talk about alliances of opportunity, a very common thing when it comes to warfare and the collection of strategic resources. And this is where Russia comes in. Now, Russia has a vested interest in growing its monopoly on energy resources that are coming out of the Middle East. They are constantly vying for control over certain natural gas and oil pipelines that run through Syria or could potentially run through Turkey, through the Black Sea and into the Eurozone markets. Russia wants great control of this because it's a huge boom to their economy. Now, as they're being strangulated by the Western world, they need to intervene as much as possible for their economic interests. And this is where they clash with Israel and the Western world, because after the freedom or liberation of Iraq, the United States sent in its contractors, its engineers, its private companies to suck up some of these resources and try and establish some kind of economic foothold in the region. Of course, it's not possible when you're dealing with a bunch of sub-90 IQ individuals. But this is why Russia is supporting these regimes that are against Israel, because it's in their economic interest. If it was not in their economic interest, they would not be involved, because they understand that it would be very bad to try and shake the hegemony of the United States and in particular Israel. This is not a war that they want. It's a war they must fight in order to try and gain the economic upper hand, because they're severely suffering from Western intervention and embargoes into their economy. And yet they're doing okay. They're holding on. And really, I'm not even in support of Putin or Russia or any of the Eastern Bloc countries, because they represent still a threat to the Western world in some way, shape, or form. But you have to understand the position that they have been forced into. Now, if you'd like to explore a little bit deeper into this, you could look up something like the Greater Israel Plan and the territories that Israel wants to seize for itself, a sort of Jewish Lebensraum, essentially, or living space. I'd also encourage you to look up the Green Revolution, the social media revolution that's organized by groups like the CIA through their NGOs, or non-government organizations, and how most of these things like the Arab Spring are artificially created and funded by Western powers in order to destabilize these, incredibly stable fascist regimes in the Middle East, who are, as I said, a direct threat to Israel's sovereignty. Now, finally, on to the question of, is this the start of World War III? I don't believe so, no. Is it possible? Sure, anything is possible in the crazy clown world that we live in today, but I don't think so. These types of events have been going on for a long time. It just depends on who is willing to strike first. If Assad manages to hold on to his power and fully reinstate himself and end this pointless civil war, then we may see a calming down in tensions in the Middle East until Israel devises a way, to reignite the conflict and finally drag Assad kicking and screaming out of his capital city. Now, it just so happens that tomorrow I'm going to do a video on why you generally shouldn't join the armed forces, and I hope that this will be a good precursor to that. If you understand why the United States gets involved in these foreign conflicts, you will better understand why you should not get involved in the military. But I'll leave that video for tomorrow. If you've enjoyed this or you have any questions about this particular geopolitical conflict, or if you have any more information you can add to the discussion, please leave me a comment down below, or you can find me on my social media links in the description. Thanks for listening.